I suspect that a lot of things I'll talk about, some of you may know some of, but hopefully the whole context will be helpful. So I'm going to try to talk about this topic here. This is the one that was given to me. More specifically, try to give you a view of the overall landscape of the regulatory environment around the raw material, this whole supply chain for raw materials up through cosmetic products, and we can talk about that. I recognize you've heard a lot, so if you don't remember anything else, okay, these are the 4 things I'd love for you to remember if you don't remember anything else. With regards to your products, you have to know your stakeholders. You have to know who you're trying to address. You got to know what your product is and how it is regulated, both the product as well as the ingredients in it. Understand your stakeholders' needs and requirements, and then pick your market, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So just to some context, so in the past, in general, ingredients were primarily natural or naturally derived. There wasn't a lot of science out there. There wasn't a lot of low-level detection. There wasn't a lot of toxicological endpoints out there. And there was a traditional acceptance of safety, which basically meant if you had a product on the market and it wasn't causing someone to get sick at an alarming rate, you were probably okay. And as a result of that, we have happy people. This is a happy person, and I hope you like the animation there. That was for your benefit if you missed it. There you go. Okay? That's the past. So what do we have today? We have a mixture of natural and synthetic ingredients. And of course I put synthetic in the scary font just not because it's Halloween, but because many people will perceive that a synthetic ingredient is by its very nature more harmful, less safe than a natural ingredient, even though from a scientific standpoint that is clearly not the case. There is a significant amount of science with an increasingly lower level of quantification. What I mean by that is a few years ago you might analyze a product and not be able to find something at 10 ppm or 100 ppm. Today you can go down to ppb, ppt, and you can find things virtually anywhere. I think there's a general skepticism of corporate honesty, and we'll talk a little bit about this with regards to NGOs. But we're just not trusted partners in the consumer's eyes, and along with that, the government's not trusted either. You can go back 20 years ago, and if the government said this was okay, most people said, that sounds fine to me. Today, that's not the case. So that there's been a shift from the corporation honesty, the government's ability to protect the consumer, and of course, the consumer's looking elsewhere for that guidance now. And this results in unhappy people, and that's where we are today. So this is the framework. I'm going to talk just a little bit about this. I won't take a lot of time, but I think it's worth setting the stage. And I hope you can see this in the back. Basically, at the bottom of the slide are the raw material suppliers. Comes up through fragrance houses, other formulators, cosmetic ingredient supply companies, through the consumer product companies, to the retailer, and to the consumer. Okay, so that's the supply chain. And this is not meant to be all inclusive. I've just kind of picked the big ones here. So first of all, we have chemical registration. As you probably know, in many countries around the world, if you want to put a chemical substance on the market, you must register it. If I was standing here 10 years ago, I remember at that time there were 7 or 8 countries / regions around the world that had chemical substance registration. Today, the number's around 20. And there are at least 6 or 7 that are considering implementing something, and I'm assuming there will be more as well. So I would guess 10 years from now, that number may be 30 or 40 different countries that have some sort of chemical substance registration requirements. The fragrance houses and cosmetic ingredient houses, they also have their own internal assessments. So I know in the fragrance industry, we invest millions of dollars to make sure that the ingredients that we use, as well as the fragrance formulations that we sell, are safe for their intended use. And cosmetic ingredient companies do the same thing. We utilize a variety of means, academicians, expert panels, externally applied safety assessments, so forth and so on. We have customs and trade restrictions that govern what materials we can bring from where, what materials we can ship to where, and for what purpose. And those change depending on the political climate. We have CPG company restrictions. They will come upon us on top of the regulations and make additional restrictions regarding not only their company, where it's positioned, but also specific brands that might vary brand to brand. The FDA, and I'll include any cosmetic regulations that are out there. So in the EU, you've got CLP, in the US, you have FDA, in China, you have the own. So there's a cosmetic regulatory framework that sits on top of that. There's Nagoya and CITES. I won't go into details there, but that's also regulating the types of materials they can use and also the financial benefits that you have to give back to the indigenous people from which that ingredient came from. There are country and regional restrictions on top of that. There are retailer restrictions, and then there are state, county, and city restrictions out there. So this is the regulatory framework that we live in. And even though we're not, I'll say, extremely excited about this patchwork of regulations, I think most of us who've been in the business long enough, we've gotten used to it. We know how to work within it, and it is complex and ever-changing, but it is the way you do business in this market. You need to make sure you understand how your product's being regulated. I'm just going to talk briefly about this. Are we talking about a consumer product? Are we talking about labeling? Are we talking about health concerns, environmental concerns? These are the kinds of questions you have to ask. Are you talking about a component of a particular consumer product? Are you talking about a stabilizer system? Are you talking about a fragrance? Are you talking about some sort of delivery system? Each of those may be regulated differently depending on the purpose of the ingredients in your product. And then it gets down to classification or characterization of the ingredients. Are you talking about a substance, a purely defined substance? Are you talking about a natural complex substance? Are you talking about an isomer ratio? All of those things affect how you assess the safety of the ingredients in your product. And then there's the old, how hard do you look? Okay, this is my, I stole this from somewhere, it's just a generic gas chromatograph graph, and my point here is if you just pick an arbitrary level and say, I'm going to look at this substance, and let's just say pretend it's a natural complex substance, I'm going to do a safety assessment on this, and I'm going to look down to some arbitrary level. If I pick that level, I've got 4 peaks to look at. I have 4 substances that I have to evaluate the various endpoints against. If I go a little lower, I have around 13. If I go a little lower, I have over 40. So how hard you look and how far the regulations force you to go have an exponential impact on the amount of time and money you're going to spend to get a particular product cleared. So if you look at all those things, even though I said before I don't really like it, I think we have a fairly robust regulatory structure. I'm very happy with it. It's a firm foundation. I can go to my customers, I can stand in front of regulators, I can go out there and I can just explain this to them with a certain sense of confidence that we are putting products on the market that are safe for their intended use. And I'm proud of that. But when consumers look at this, they don't see it the same way I do. And a lot of it comes back to how we make our decisions. Okay? And I put a few up here. So when you go out and start talking about this, it becomes a lot of interpretation. I have a test result. I have a high dose, a mid dose, and a low dose result. And I may interpret those a certain way with regards to my classification of my material, with regards to my margin of safety. Another scientist may read exactly the same report and come to a very different conclusion. So we talk about weight of evidence. We talk about trying to accumulate enough information to convince the people who may not be, I'll say, friendly to us, that this is in fact safe. And we use a variety of means here. And if you look at some of the ones up there, the first one clearly is no longer applicable. You can't just say, well, it's been in the market for a long time, it seems safe to me. That just doesn't work anymore. We list here modeling, threshold of toxicological concern, read across. Just talking about read across, I think most of you know, read across basically is where I have 2 substances. I have test data on one, I don't have test data on the other. What is the mechanism that I can convince people that the test data on the first is applicable to the second? Sounds relatively straightforward, it's not. I think ECHA, their guidance document, if I remember right, is around 35 pages of guidance on how you should do that assessment to make sure that you're making a fairly decent read across that'll stand up to scrutiny. In vitro data, animal data, human data, HRBT we talked about before, these are all the options we have before us. And you have to talk about the endpoints of concern. What is the exposure route of your product to the consumer? Are they inhaling it? Is it applied dermally? Do we have to worry about environmental issues? Is it a rinse off, leave on? These are all things that determine the environmental and human safety endpoints that you have to look at. And again, when I add all this together, I'm very happy. I'm confident I can go out there and explain this. And I think of this like a house with a very firm foundation. I've got my safety assessments. I've got my decision protocols with my roof. It's a beautiful house. I can envision it on the hill. But when consumers look at this, this is what they see. They see a house that perhaps has some indication of former grandeur, but is in horrible disrepair and is no longer a place you could ever want to live. That's what they see. Okay? Why do they see that? Well, they see that because they're genuinely confused. You can just Google search cosmetics, cancer, cosmetics, health concern, and any words like that, and this is what you'll see. And I had plenty to choose from. These are the ones I just picked first. Okay, so you can imagine a consumer that doesn't understand threshold toxicological concern, doesn't understand the difference between acute and chronic aquatic toxicity, frankly doesn't care. And this is what they read, this is what they see. And a significant portion of the population is going to believe this. So how do we deal with this? Clearly we're transitioning. If you go back 20 years ago, the fragrance industry and largely the cosmetic industry was a self-regulated entity. There were regulations around the fringes, but you still had a great deal of autonomy on how you made decisions about putting products on the market. And then that's changing, clearly. So every day that goes by, the government steps in just a little bit more and regulates just a little bit more. And that's nothing we can do about that apart from being diligent and lobbying and doing all the right things with our government. The problem, as I see it, is that consumers don't really care about that either. And they're moving away from a government or an industry statement of safety to their own personal assessment of safety. They want to make their own decision on whether or not this product is appropriate to bring into my home. And how do they do that? They're not going to be scientific experts. They're going to rely on somebody to tell them that. And it's not going to be us. And we talk a lot about hazard and risk when we get into these discussions with groups. I meet with NGOs a lot and we have this discussion all the time. And I know you guys know this. Hazard is the potential to cause harm. Risk is the likelihood it will cause harm at a particular dose. That's the difference. And when you begin regulating on hazard, you have a big problem. And when you begin to eliminate ingredients from your products based on hazard, you have a big problem. The example I always use is water. I think it's been mentioned a couple times already. Water is life-affirming, life-giving. We all know that we can't live without it. However, in larger quantities, it can be deadly, not only in a flood scene like I've listed there, but perhaps more appropriate for this discussion, water has an LD50. For those of you who don't know what an LD50 is, that's the amount of water that I would consume and have a 50% chance of dying. Okay, and it's not a huge amount of water, so without giving away my body weight, which I'd rather not do, if you do the calculation, for me, it comes out to about 5.5 liters of water. So if I drink 5.5 liters of water in a relatively short period of time, I've got a 50% chance of dying.
So that's oral, not inhalation?
That's oral, yeah. Yeah. Much smaller if you inhale it. Yeah. Okay, so if you look at what I might typically drink after a workout, assuming I ever worked out, or a long bike ride or something, you might come up with a margin of safety of around 7, 8, 9, something like that. Okay, I can tell you, if I had a substance in a fragrance formula that had an LD50 like this with a margin of safety of around 8 that could cause death, there is no way I could ever put that in a product. Ever. Okay, and this isn't to suggest that we should regulate water, but what I am suggesting is there's a different perspective when it comes to consumer products and specifically cosmetics and fragrances. People are not willing to accept any risk there, whereas in water, they accept that risk every single day. They get in cars every single day, they have a glass of wine at the evening, it doesn't bother them at all. On the products that we're talking about, you have to have margins of safety of 100 or 1,000. If you apply that to water, I would probably be very thirsty at the end of the day. But that's the structure we live in today. So if you think about the future of cosmetics, now I took this picture just to spice things up. I got a new camera, I was very excited about it. So I think if you look at cosmetics, you know, it's still a very beautiful thing. It's amazing, but you got to be careful you don't get stung. And I think as we look at the regulations, that's kind of the area that we're in. And there's 3 things I want to talk about to try to avoid getting stung, and that's transparency, collaboration, and market segmentation. So this is kind of I've set the stage now, the framework. These are the 3 things I'd like to talk about going forward. Transparency, I put a quote up there from the Dalai Lama. Basically, people no longer think that a secret is necessarily a good thing. If you think back, and I forget what brand it was, but somebody used to advertise they had secret sauce. right? They went all over the place. They got the secret sauce, and this was a good thing. People thought, wow, it's secret. This must be something good. Today, not so much. If you don't tell people what's in things, they start to get nervous. What are you hiding? But what does transparency mean? And I've listed a bunch of things up there. For some people, it means ingredient disclosure. I've got to tell them the substances that are in the product. Other people want to know where it came from, and how do I know that I have a solid track back to the origin so I can prove, in fact, that if I tell you I harvested in Madagascar, that in fact the product in your hand was made from an ingredient that came from Madagascar. Process disclosure. Some people want to know, well, how did I make it? Yeah, you told me it was natural, but I want to know how you did it. How harsh were the chemicals? What were the temperatures involved? Was there high pressure involved? How much did you distill off this thing? They want to know these things. Sometimes it's renewability. How do I know that the ingredients that you use, you're not, clearing the rainforest? I want to know that it's renewable resources. Some people want to know the safety assessment, and clearly there's others. So if you talk to your stakeholders, depending on who you ask, it could mean any or all of these things. And this is going back to the knowing your stakeholders. You are not going to be able to satisfy everyone with regards to transparency. So you're going to have to understand what your stakeholders are looking for perhaps a particular brand, and figure out how far down that road you want to go with transparency. I talked a little bit about source country. This is an example that we have in our industry all the time. You may harvest the leaves from a number of different places. You may bring it together. You may do the extraction in another location, and then you may actually distill the final product in a third location. And the question is, well, where did this stuff come from? I could give any of those answers. They would all be technically partially correct. None of them would be completely correct. And these are the kinds of discussions you have to have with people to make them understand that it's not a simple supply chain. It's not like I can take the box of the cosmetic and tell you that every single ingredient was picked over here, put in a truck, brought here, and there it is in your box. It's not that easy, particularly when you get into some of the complex stabilizers, in some cases fragrances. So this is an ingredient list. So this is along the lines of transparency, telling people what's in a product. So if you look at this list, it is what it is. These are ingredients in a common product. And if you read through that list and you look at it, and I'll kind of summarize it, the vast majority of substances on that list have absolutely no toxicological data. No one has ever looked at any of those ingredients with regards to systemic toxicity, repro-developmental, target organ effects, none of it. And the few that have been looked at have some issues with them. Irritation, toxicity, some issues that you may be concerned about. Okay, this product, if you haven't seen this slide before, this is a banana. Okay, no one's concerned about bananas. But if you gave that ingredient list to someone and didn't tell them it was a banana, this would be a problem for them. And that's the challenge we have with our ingredient list. When you start breaking down the ingredients in any consumer product down to those levels and looking at the various toxicity studies you have or don't have, it's a very, very difficult discussion. And somehow, and I think it was mentioned, I think you mentioned before, that it's the education issue. Trying to explain to people that chemical substances are not necessarily bad. They can be very harmful. This is not a joke. I had a reporter call me the other day asking me what IFF was doing to remove chemicals from our fragrances. I mean, where do you start with that, right? In terms of transparency, the other thing you can do, and it was on my list, is you can start sharing safety assessments. And the cosmetic industry does this through the CIRs, the fragrance industry does it, so this is just a snapshot of a website. As I mentioned before, we invest millions of dollars to assess our fragrance ingredients, and we are now publicly posting the safety assessments. So they're out there. Anyone can go out there and look. Now, as I mentioned before, we have 2,200 to do. I think if you go out to the website today, there's probably 60 published or something like that. But remember, we're doing 13 endpoints against every single one of those ingredients. So you can do the math and figure out how many tests we're doing, how many read across we have to do, application of TTC, so forth and so on. But we're publishing it.
Is IFF doing it alone or with RIFM or anything?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, apologies. Yeah, this is an industry effort. So our trade association, Research Institute for Fragrance Materials, is the one coordinating this. IFF, of course, as a manufacturer, we supply the data for our ingredients. In fairness, Givaudan supplies for theirs, Firmenich for theirs, and so forth. And then if there are gaps, and we all recognize there will be gaps. So if I launch a product into the market say 20 years ago, and I met the standard of the day, I would have a dossier of safety data that was appropriate for that time and day. If I move forward 20 years and take a look at what's required today, I'm going to say, well, gee, you know, did anyone ever do phototoxicity? Well, no one ever thought about that. It's a laundry detergent. Well, it doesn't matter. People care about phototoxicity today. What about biodegradability? Well, you know, maybe it was a cosmetic ingredient. It's leave-on, not rinse-off. It doesn't matter. You have to do biodegradability now. So there will be gaps, and we're filling those gaps. But the bottom line is it's out there, it's published. The NGOs can see it. Anyone can see it. You can see it. Any consumer can see it. And it's going to be an interesting discussion as they start to read these things. Particularly, as most of you know, when you do a toxicological test, you will typically do a high dose, a mid dose, and a low dose. The high dose typically has to be the maximum tolerable dose in order to be OECD certified. When you go to that level, you will often get high dose effects. Those high dose effects can then trigger hazard classification. That hazard classification then triggers certain other classifications, and it begins to show up on certain lists, Prop 65. Substances of very high concern in Europe and so forth, and you have to defend these materials at the dose that we're using. The one that we tend to use is a methodology known as a Tanimoto scoring. So basically you would look at two chemical structures, you score each one, and if the scoring is close enough, you have a valid case to read across. We don't use that in isolation. As I mentioned before, ECHA issued 35 pages of wonderful guidance on how to do read across. We have to use that guidance anyway for all the REACH registrations, so we use that as well. The idea is to make sure that you're making a solid read across, because to be honest, no one wants to be challenged on this. If you do a read across, you want it to hold up. There's going to be a lot more transparency with regards to cosmetic manufacturing. You now have to register your site. There'll have to be cosmetic ingredient disclosure. There'll have to be adverse event reporting, which we already have in Europe under cosmetic vigilance. And then they're going to define some criteria for this phrase that I put in quotes here, adequately substantiated for safe use. So for example, in the fragrance industry today, we define what are the criteria to be safe for intended use. We feel very good about it. We published it. It's been peer reviewed. It's out there. People can disagree with it, but in the absence of anything else, we're very, very comfortable with it. In this case, the FDA will make that decision for us. So that's transparency. The second one is collaboration. And this is a somewhat sensitive topic. I've been involved in a lot of collaboration with what I'll call the adversarial aspects of the industry. So I'll kind of give you my view, and we can talk about it. The first thing is there's a natural inclination not to want to collaborate with, and I'll just put the NGOs on the other side. I know they're not all evil, but most of them are, so we'll put them over here, okay? So why don't we collaborate with NGOs as a regular part of our business? Well, the first reason is because we have science, right? I don't know where they get their degrees, but we have science on our side, and we're going to stand by that, so I don't really need to collaborate with them. We have a lot of expertise. We've been doing this for hundreds of years. We know what we're doing. If I didn't mention it, we have science on our side. And there's a fear here involved. When you start having a collaboration with an NGO, where does this go? Where does this lead? What are they going to say in the public space? What if they find out something you don't want them to find out? So there's a natural little bit of fear there. And of course, the last one is the science, right? I've seen some of their science. It's crazy stuff. I mean, when you talk to them, it's insane. So this is why we don't really want to talk to them. Why don't they want to talk to us? Well, because we're in it for the money, right? We make money doing this. We have a vested interest to tell the public anything we can in order to sell a product and make a profit. We're in it for the money. They don't believe our science. Frankly, they think our science is bought and paid for. They just don't believe it. We're in it for the money. We'll mention that again, right? And there's a fear on their side. I mean, you have to remember the dynamic that they're talking about. They have a cash flow problem as well. Their entire cash flow model is based on donations from concerned citizens and organizations. And how do you get concerned organizations and citizens? You make them afraid of something. That's the way it works. If an NGO begins to collaborate with business too closely, what do all the other NGOs do? They all tell all the fundraisers out there, I don't know what they're doing over there, they're in bed with business. And the funding dries up, and I can tell you personally, I've had two, I was going to say three, but two for sure, two very good collaborations with NGOs. We got up right to the very end when we were going to go public with a collaboration, and they came and said, we just can't do it. We've just got calls from NGO 1, 2, and 3 that said if we do this, they're going to call us out on it. It happens. And then last one, we would sell close relatives for money. Okay? So that's where they come from. And you get into a discussion about whose science is better, right? My science is better than your science is better than my science. And as I mentioned before, you know, legitimately, you can read these safety assessments and not get into details, but if you have a high dose effect, is it a primary effect? Is it a secondary effect? Is it enough to trigger a classification? You know, what kind of dosage did you do? Did you overwhelm some other part of the system? And you can have these discussions, and there are differences of opinion. So I think at some point we're going to have these discussions with our adversaries. We cannot afford to continue to have this butting of heads every time we publish something as safe and they say it's not safe. I think public dissemination of safety information has become a norm. I think we're going to have to do that. As I said, this industry, fragrances, is already doing it, as well as cosmetics. You have to include academia. They can be difficult at times, but they, to some extent, are the independent arbitrators here. The businesses on one side, the NGOs on the other. Academia can often play a role in the middle to kind of bring some sanity to this. And we may not always like what they have to say, but it often is a reasonable compromise in order to be able to move forward. You have to include the NGOs. I mean, they're crazy people, but you have to include them. And you have to find some common basis. And I can tell you, in my experience, the only common basis, the way I always start, is you sit across the table and you know, we think our chemicals are safe, or we think you're poisoning the world. Where do I go with that, right? I always go back to, you know, I love my kids. You love your kids, right? Okay, that's a starting point, right? That's some place we can both agree on. We both love our kids. So let's start there, and then maybe we can find a path forward. Because if you start at the other end, there's no hope. And you have to include government officials in this. This is not an exercise that can be done in isolation of the government. The government is under huge pressure from the consumers and stakeholders to do something. You know, if you have an adverse reaction in the general population to a particular product or brand, you probably know them better than I do, the government is under huge pressure to do something. So you have to include them in this conversation. And I'll give you an example of this, and I'm not suggesting this is without risk. It has huge risk. But I'll give you a brief example. So the fragrance industry, as you all know, is faced with thermal sensitizers. This has been a long-standing issue, particularly in Europe. So many years ago, Europe came out with a list of 16 that they said you must label if you use over a certain amount. And the industry was, I'll say, caught somewhat by surprise. We could argue about whether they should or should not have been caught by surprise, but they were. But we adjusted and we did what the government said we had to do, and we carry on. Then about 3 years ago, the Europeans said, you know, we were thinking about that list of 16. We think it's more like 100 now. And again, we were taken by surprise. So we're in the process of doing what we need to do there. But now we've said, look, if we don't change this model, if we don't change this paradigm, what's going to happen in about another 8 to 10 years? The government's going to come back and say, you know, we were thinking about that list of 100. We think it's more like 500, right? That's what's going to happen. So we put together this thing called the International Dialogue for the Evaluation of Allergens. We invited the government, the EU Commission, the SCCS we talked about earlier, academia, the industry. And we sit down in a room and we talk about this stuff. And you know, it's slow going, it's hard going, but I think if we continue this discussion, it's going to be very difficult for the EU Commission to surprise us with another list, because we're talking about how you define allergens. How do you use allergens safely? And we're in this discussion together. So, you know, we'll see over time whether this works or not. And as I said before, it is not without risk. Once you start down that path, you have lost some control, because it's now a partnership. It's not unilateral anymore. Talked about transparency, collaboration. The third one is really market segmentation. And this is, again, you may have a different view. This is how I see it as a supplier to the cosmetic market. There's a whole bunch of markets out there, and I think in the last panel they talked about how natural was irrelevant for 10 years or so. I would not know that by the briefs that I get. A huge percentage of the briefs I get require natural. So it may have, maybe not have any scientific relevance. It may not even have consumer relevance, but the cosmetic industry still believes it has a relevance in the market. And you've got free from markets. We've talked about free from in the panel discussion the other day. Be free from GMO, free from allergens, synthetics, phthalates, parabens, the list goes on and on. The free from market. There's a low cost market. There will always be a low cost market. There's now a sustainable market, including renewability and source origin tracking. There's a clean label market. And there's probably others I don't even know about yet. So you're not going to be able to meet all of those needs in a single product. Choices are going to have to be made. You're going to have to decide. Went too far. If you think about this, natural in many cases is not particularly sustainable. The footprint is huge. You look at the carbon footprint, you look at the water usage, you look at transport costs, you look at yield. Natural, if you look at the carbon footprint of a natural versus synthetic, oftentimes the synthetic is much more sustainable than the natural. Sustainable may not be low cost or natural for that matter. Low cost is probably not free from, natural is certainly not free from. Free from is probably not natural, and natural is probably not low cost. So as you look at this, you have to find a way through it. Again, going back to my second slide, you have to know your stakeholders. You have to know what market are you trying to approach. Because a one-size-fits-all is going to be very difficult to win in the market. So when we get these kinds of briefs coming into us, we want natural, free from this, sustainable, renewable, low cost. You're like, okay, well, we can give you something that will do this, but I don't think you're going to like it very much. And they typically don't perform well. So I think you will have to choose what you want to do. The bottom line is you have a lot of consumers with a lot of different divergent needs and sensitivities. They all have their own concerns. And now they have a whole mechanism in the internet on how to communicate with each other. And this is really driving them to not feel alone. They now have a voice. So again, if my mother had a problem with a product, she might write a letter to the company, maybe write a letter to the editor, maybe she would tell her friends, and maybe her whole universe of people that she could possibly influence was probably 100, 150, maybe. Now, no matter what your view is, you can find tens of thousands of people who agree with you. Hundreds of thousands, probably, in a matter of days. And you now have a voice. And for me, it comes down to trust. And I kind of alluded to this earlier. I think the industry, and I'll use fragrance industry because this is my industry, I think we have lost the trust of the consumers. If I say IFF looked at this and said it's okay, how much do you make IFF off that product you sold me? In many cases, I think even the major brand holders don't have the clout in the market. Anybody say, just to name them, P&G, Clorox, or any of them, can they stand up in the marketplace and say, no, we've looked at this and it's okay. Is that enough today? I don't think it is. So somehow we have to get this trust back, and the consumers are clearly moving to other people. We talked about it before. They moved to NGOs, they moved to the social media, they moved to other people to tell them what's okay for them to use and what not. And I think largely our success is going to be contingent upon our ability to really manage that conversation and to regain that trust. If I look at the future again, I think we have to continue to be an active participation in the legislative process. You can't let the legislators just go off and do whatever they want. They'll do crazy things. You have to be part of that conversation. You have to explain to them the science. You have to give them the other side of the story. We need to be clear about our definitions. In the past, we've gotten in trouble with this. So when we're to talk about renewable, again, from a supply chain standpoint, I need to understand what you mean by renewable. I need to have a clear understanding so that when I give you something, it may not be my definition of renewable, but you're the one that's putting the product on the market. I have to understand what you mean by renewable. But I think we're going to have to continue to be diligent about that. You just can't let there be only one voice out there. You have to continue to tell that other side of the story. And I use this as an example. I think you guys all know this. Anheuser-Busch for a long time refused to give up the ingredients of their beer. They said, no, we're not doing it. It's proprietary, it's confidential, you don't need to know. And they held that line for a long time. And the Food Babe went out and did a survey. She got 43,000 signatures in about, 24 hours, and Anheuser-Busch capitulated. They gave it and said, we'll do it. Okay, now, if you look at the number of consumers in the United States, this comes out to around 200 ppm, the 43,000. So a 200 ppm consumer base changed Anheuser-Busch's position on transparency. That's the kind of thing that we're up against. And I think we're going to have to be flexible, we're going to have to be adaptable. We just can't continue to rely I'm a science-based guy, I believe in the science, but I know that science cannot win the day by itself. And I think the last point, the supply chain has to work as a partnership. This is not something that the cosmetic companies can win by themselves. It's certainly not something the fragrance industry can win by themselves, or the raw materials suppliers, the farmers can win by themselves. This has got to be a partnership across the whole supply chain if we're going to meet this challenge. It's another picture I took. I thought this was somewhat illustrative of how I see the future here. This little boy, this was in the evening, and I was standing back and he was talking to his father, and he had the idea of going fishing with his dad, right? And I think his concept when he was going out, it would take about 10 minutes to get a basket of fish and go home. I mean, that was his thinking. And I was listening to his father explain to him as his dad got out of his lawn chair, his coffee. He's like kind of settled in for the long run. This is going to be hours sitting here, And the kid was just a little confused, and he kind of just wandered over his pole, just started watching the end of the pole, just desperately hoping something would happen, something positive so he could go home. Right? And I think that's the way I think about this challenge that we're facing. It's probably going to be a lot longer and a lot harder than we envision. But I think if we stick to it, we'll catch some fish, we'll be fine. It's just going to take some time. And I think that's it. Depends on the claim that you want to make. So if you want to say this is a cucumber with other natural flavors, so like on the flavor side, that'd be a WOMF. And you have to think about, and the way the legislation reads on that flavor side is it has to be characterizing. What does that mean? We all have our own definitions of that. If you want to make a claim, it was maybe to the point he was raising, made with, made with real cucumber. If I put a little bit of cucumber in there, it's probably not characterizing at all. And in fact, if you look at most grape flavors today, if you drink something or taste it, it does not taste like a grape, right? We all recognize that, right? We've gone way beyond grape at this point. But what the consumer expects to taste when they think of grape flavored is no longer connected to grape. But if someone wants to say made with real grape, is grape the characterizing note or not? Probably not, because consumers wouldn't buy it if it was. So going back to it's really important for us to know what your claim is going to be and how you want to defend that. And then we can figure out how comfortable you are with what we're going to do. Yeah, the question was, if in the U.S., if you have a new chemical substance, you need to file a PMN? Absolutely, yes.
So then, for everyone else, what is a PMN?
Yeah, so when you manufacture...
A pre-manufactured notice. So if you're going to bring something into the United States that's never been brought in before, you're going to manufacture something that's never been brought in before, you have to go to the EPA and say, look, this is what I want to do, here's the material, you file a PMN, and then the EPA reviews it. And in today's world, you are more likely than not going to get what they call a significant new use rule, a SNUR. This is the EPA's gift to us. They believe this is a good thing. It is not. It comes with a huge amount of paperwork associated with it for any downstream user, and typically our customers don't want to use materials that have SNURs. So the question is, if you had an ingredient that was only going to be used in cosmetics, you would not have to file a PMN. The point is, though, the fragrance industry uses the same ingredients on the one side as the other. We have virtually no ingredients that are only used on one side, except for some very, very expensive extracts that no one can afford to use in laundry detergent. So the vast majority of materials are used on both sides, so we have to register.